You're listening to GOAZCATS.com today, a podcast all about your Arizona Wildcats. Featuring the latest news and analysis from the staff at GOAZCATS.com. Plus, interviews with players, coaches, and expert guests from across the Rivals.com network. Now, straight from the old Pueblo, Tucson, Arizona, here's the host of GOAZCATS.com today, Matt Moreno.
Happy Monday, everybody. It's the GOAZCATS.com today podcast. We're back here after Arizona's win over Northern Arizona on Saturday night. We're going to be taking a look at just how things went. You know, there was a lot of disappointed people with the end result. Arizona wins that game 65-41. Sets a record in the first half by scoring 51 points, new school record for most points in a half. But the second half was kind of left a sour taste, I think, in a lot of people's mouths just because of how it ended. And NAU outscores Arizona 28-14 in the second half. A lot to talk about this week. There's a big game coming up this Saturday night against Texas Tech, the first Power 5 opponent for Arizona of the season. It gets real now, guys. I mean, this is the time of year when we're going to find out what Arizona's made of. We still really don't understand fully what they are, who they are. I think we have a better understanding right now than we did after the Hawaii game, but I don't know that everything is good. It's probably a lot more negatives to talk about right now with this team than there are positives, and that's not a good sign going into your first meeting with a Power 5 school. So we're going to jump into things. Welcome again to the podcast, and let's just get right into it. I think the first place to start is with the negatives when it comes to Arizona and that game against NAU. Obviously, there were a lot of things that stood out on the negative side when you look at that second half. Kevin Sumlin comes into that press conference late Saturday night, and it doesn't look thrilled, and he kind of lets it be known. Talks about the penalties, talks about what happened defensively with this team, and he lets it be known that there's going to be changes if things like the penalties continue to happen. Arizona ended the night with 11 penalties for 127 yards. A couple guys have to leave the game. Christian Young, I think, was the most notable one with his 2 unsportsmanlike conduct penalties, 2 things that could have been avoided. They weren't, egregious penalties. It wasn't anything that was, crazy, but it's still an important part of the game. And if you're not going to be able to be on the field because of something you do, that's just not going to sit well with someone like Kevin Sumlin. And he let that be known. I mean, he continued to say something that he said the week before, which is that, if guys aren't ready to go and they're going to, be selfish, in using his words, they're not going to be on the field. Arizona needs someone like Christian Young out there, but if it's going to be a problem with him, out on the field, and he's going to be having issues like he had Saturday night, it's not going to help the team when he's not out there. So we'll see. Hopefully he can get that corrected, because Arizona is at a crucial point of the season. This is the game I think everyone kind of had in mind before the season started against Texas Tech, knowing that I keep phrasing it as this is the turning point of the season. We're going to know which way this season can go based off this game, I think, and it can continue to not go well, and that's after a win. That's saying that after a win, but things aren't going well right now for Arizona, and this game is going to be an important one to dictate kind of where things go from here. If Arizona is able to get a win against Texas Tech, I think there's a lot of positive things that can happen moving forward. UCLA hasn't looked great. You can open Pac-12 play with a win, and you can get a couple games over 500, and as you head into the the heavy part of the Pac-12 schedule, and feel good about yourselves. But we're going to start with the negatives after I just mentioned feeling good about yourselves. But I think those stand out for most people right now as we sit here, on Monday, kind of recapping and thinking about what took place Saturday night. The first half was great. I mean, that's what Arizona should have done to a team like NAU. I mentioned kind of leading up to the game that this is not, a good NAU team. They've had good teams in the past, but this is not one of them. I think we saw that play out as things kind of unfolded Saturday night with Arizona. The second half, I think, is where everyone wants to kind of focus, and where the focus should be, because it just wasn't good. I mean, Arizona needs to play better than what it showed in that second half, that last 30 minutes. The defense, they made some changes. There wasn't as many starters in that game in the second half for Arizona. Someone like Colin Schooler didn't even play in the second half. So you had some replacement guys in there, some reserves. And, one of the gripes is that Arizona's reserve should still be better than an FCS team. And that's true. I mean, there's really no excuse for kind of what took place in the second half. I mentioned leading up to the game that I believe 25 points was kind of that threshold. If NAU is able to get more than 25 points, it's a bad sign. NAU gets 41. It's a bad sign. There's no way to work around that, even when you don't have some of your starters in the game. As Kevin Sumlin mentioned afterward, there were still some starters in the game in the second half who allowed NAU to score 28 points in that last 30 minutes, and that's a big deal. I mean, that's something that just can't happen. As we kind of knew and understood, there wasn't going to be a lot that changed in a couple weeks from the Hawaii game to the NAU game. I think the hope was that things could get figured out, and maybe some of those decisions that were made by the coaching staff in the NAU game would change, and that's where the progress would come. But for as good as the defense looked in that first half, it was overshadowed by what took place in the second half, and there was still those same issues. And to me, that's the biggest area of concern for this team right now, is that a lot of the things that went negative, that went bad in that game against NAU in the second half, are a lot of the same things that we were talking about a couple weeks ago after the Hawaii game. The middle of the field, Arizona continuing to get torched in the middle of the field, and teams are finding a way to use the receivers in that area of the field and to make plays happen there. That again falls on the linebackers and safeties. That's their territory, and Arizona needs to be better at that. Texas Tech, they can score, and right now Vegas believes it's going to be a high-scoring game, and I think it is. I mean, I think there's going to be it's going to be a situation where Arizona is really trying to kind of keep up, and that's a bad place to be in. I mean, this offense is capable of scoring a lot of points, but we've seen what happens at certain times when Arizona is, having a slow start, not able to kind of have the momentum it wants on the offensive side of the ball, and that can be an issue. It can't always play in those shootout type style games. So it's not where Arizona wants to be right now, heading into the third game of the season, and I think the problems and everything starts defensively. Kind of the 1B to the 1A of Arizona's defensive issues that came up in the second half of that game are the penalties. As I mentioned, 11 penalties for 127 yards, and it's not as though this is a one-off situation. This has kind of become a norm under Kevin Sumlin, and that's not a good thing. Arizona, having double-digit penalties and getting into trouble, and he's fine with, an occasional holding or pass interference or something that comes, within the course of a game. That's just going to happen. A play where you're trying to make an effort, but it's the unsportsmanlike penalties. They had a targeting call in that game. It's things like that, the personal fouls that really are bothering him right now, and you just can't have those. And this team, as I mentioned before, just can't have those types of plays and expect to win games, because as the schedule continues to get tougher, the margin for error is just so thin for Arizona right now. They don't have the type of team that can overcome things like that, can overcome different types of issues. They've been good about not turning the ball over. Obviously the Hawaii game, you had the red zone interception that stands out to a lot of people, but in this game, I mean, there was Arizona had no turnovers, and that was even throwing in a freshman quarterback. So it's just been interesting to see this kind of develop and see this. You're now starting to see the trends now that Kevin Sumlin's, whatever it is, 14 games into his career at Arizona, and one of the bad trends is the penalties, and that's now been 2 games in a row where Arizona's had some issues. It's a tough spot to be in for a coach, for a team, and it starts with the coaching staff. I mean, that's discipline comes from the coaching staff, and Kevin Sumlin can say everything he wants to say, look as stern as he did after the game Saturday night. He wasn't happy, and you could see it on his face, and maybe that's just to get the team motivated. That's always possible, but he mentioned that, it's something that's going to get taken care of and was already being taken care of. What that is, I guess we'll find out eventually, and if that even matters and how much of an effect that has. But that's going to start with him. He needs to be the one that takes control of that issue, make sure that it's clear that players who are having those kinds of problems and making those kinds of decisions are on the field. I mean, that's the easiest way to get to, especially young players, is playing time. The unfortunate part is that it is someone in this example like Christian Young who matters so much to this defense and can be such an important part of what they do. So it's going to be an issue that has to get resolved at some point. It needs to get resolved this week. Arizona can't have 11 penalties for 127 yards against Texas Tech and expect to win the game. So it's going to be an interesting part of what happens the rest of this week, and it'll be interesting to see what Kevin Sumlin says at his press conference on Monday, and we'll go from there. But it's definitely a big negative for this team, but it's something right now that's reflective of the coaching staff, and that's simply not a good thing. Now we'll get into some more of the positives of the game. There were some, believe it or not. I think the first one is something that I was excited to see, because it's something that I've been kind of preaching since going back to the spring even, but definitely in training camp, when you could see what type of players Arizona had in this running back group, when you have the addition of someone like Michael Wiley as a freshman, and then we see him shine in that game against Hawaii. But the running back group, all 5 scholarship players were able to get at least 5 carries in the game. Gary Brightwell was a star. He had 5 carries, eventually led the team with 141 yards and a touchdown, had that long 94-yard touchdown, which is tied for the second longest rush in school history. Just a great game for that group overall. You have 2 players that go over 100 yards. J.J. Taylor has 102 yards on 10 carries, plus a touchdown. Bam Smith gets 84 yards. Nathan Tilford gets 6 carries for 40 yards. Michael Wiley has 9 carries and gets 39 yards. So a good showing by that group. Arizona needed to run the ball a lot once it was able to kind of get up big on NAU in that first half, and then in the second half kind of took their foot off the gas a little bit. But I think that shows exactly what that group is capable of. It was interesting to see kind of the game plan and how much it changed coming into this game as opposed to Hawaii, when they didn't run the ball very much and it relied so much on the pass. In this game, it was flipped, and you saw why that group is so talented and why it's capable of doing the things that it did against NAU. I think Arizona should only continue to lean on that group, and if you're going to have players like that and you can go 5 deep with a running back group, there's no reason not to use it. It makes the most sense. It's going to help them on offense. It's going to help them score points, and we saw why in that game Saturday night. That group accounts for 3 touchdowns. It just makes the most sense, and it's something I hope Arizona continues to do, because it is something that's going to have to play into this offense and moving the ball and scoring points, because as things stand right now, the defense just doesn't look like it's going to be able to keep Arizona in the game enough and do enough to keep the other team from scoring. That Arizona is going to have to be able to score points and figure out ways to make that happen. And if you look at that running back group, that's the easiest way to do that, and we'll see what happens as they move forward. But a great night for that group. Anytime you can have a couple 100-yard rushers, that's going to be a solid showing. And Arizona did a lot of work in that first half, scoring 51 points, and a lot of that credit has to go to the running back group and obviously the offensive line for opening up the holes and making that a part of the game. 720 total yards. I mean, that's unreal numbers, and it shows what the offense is capable of when you lean on that running back group and kind of make everything easier for everybody else. The other positive aspect that I wanted to call out and kind of shine a light on is Grant Gunnell. Obviously, Arizona last year, Jamari Joyner was able to come into a couple games as a freshman quarterback, not in a blowout, not in a situation where it didn't matter. They brought him in the second quarter last year of the Cal game, I believe, is when he made his debut. A little bit later in the season than the second game, but Arizona opts to go with Grant Gunnell in the second quarter against NAU, and you have to see what he's about. I mean, it always felt like Arizona at some point was going to use him. I thought maybe it would come a little bit later in the year, just to preserve that red shirt. I mean, he's got 4 games he can play, so now 3 more after this one. and not use that redshirt season. You can use those games. Those games can be played at any point in the year, which is different from the old rule, which was, those, if you're going to play, you could play 4 games and still keep your red shirt, but you couldn't play, past the early portion of the season. So I figured Grant Gunnell would get in the game at some point, but it would probably be later in the year. But Arizona goes with it in the second game. Decides to put him in there in the second quarter. The game was not completely out of hand at that point, so there's still some, a little bit of pressure. I think Arizona was up 35-7 at that point. And he shined. He had a long pass play that you got to really see kind of his type of style. He ends up with 3 touchdowns. If you end up with 3 touchdowns in your college debut, and you're not the starter, that's a solid showing. He didn't have a ton of yards; he had 151 yards, but it was still more than Khalil Tate. And he only threw he only completed 9 passes, threw 11 passes. Had a quarterback rating of 287.1, which was, you'll take that any day of the week, and that's essentially what Kevin Sumlin said after the game, that, that's not a bad debut to have. Kind of shows a glimpse of what Arizona is going to be getting once Grant Gunnell is able to take over the full-time job. As I said on Twitter, and as I've been saying since, he committed to Arizona, he's an NFL guy right now, and it'll be about continuing to stay on that path. He has the body type that, they're going to be looking for at the next level, and it'll be about, and the skill set as well. I mean, it's going to be about continuing to build and stay on this path that he showed he's clearly on right now in that game Saturday night. And it'll be interesting to see how he develops and how they continue to use him this season. He was listed as the third quarterback on the depth chart, but I think everyone kind of understood the situation. If Khalil Tate either isn't as good as Arizona needs him to be, or if he runs into some kind of injury issue, I think everyone knows that if he's going to be out for a prolonged period, Grant Gunnell is going to be that guy. Khalil Tate said it himself that he's glad that Grant Gunnell was able to get in the game on Saturday night because they might need him down the road. And that's one of those situations where if Khalil Tate needs to miss the game for any period of time, any extended period of time, you're going to go to Grant Gunnell over someone like Rhett Rodriguez. Rhett Rodriguez also got in the game on Saturday night, but only handed the ball off. If Arizona needs someone, in a pinch, and Khalil Tate's, just gets a little bit banged up and only has to miss, a drive or two, then I think you will see Rhett Rodriguez. Maybe not now. Maybe Grant Gunnell is now the guy, and we'll see what happens once the depth chart is announced on Monday. But I think you couldn't ask more of Grant Gunnell in his debut. He came in off the bench, throws 3 touchdowns, has 151 yards. That's just fine, and kind of sets them up for knowing that he can do that in a game. And obviously it's against NAU. It's not against a Power 5 team. And he wasn't perfect, but I think you'll take what he showed in that game and be happy with it. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how they use him moving forward, whether, the rest of those games that he's allowed to play in come later in the season, or if they kind of bunch him up and he's back out there later this week. So we'll see what happens, but I think a positive debut for Grant Gunnell, and fans got that glimpse of what the future is going to look like. I think the offense is going to look a lot different this time next year when he's taking over, and I think it'll be a lot of fun to see Arizona throw the ball around a ton and see what Grant Gunnell can do. He's going to have to continue to improve kind of how he uses his feet and how mobile he is, but he played running back in the past. I know a lot of people find that surprising considering he's about 6'6", but he played running back, and so he has a little bit of that in him, and it'll be interesting to watch his development over the the next year and over the course of the rest of the season. All right, so now we're going to get into the portion of the podcast where you guys tell me what's on your mind, and Axe Advisor once again coming through with a voicemail and a couple questions about Arizona after Saturday's game. So I'll let you guys hear what he has to say this week, and then I'll come back and answer his questions for him.
Hey, Matt, Axe Advisor here. How are you? Hey, a couple of questions. One, on the game upcoming this week, how big is it in regards to where Kevin Sumlin is in his short career at Arizona? I see it as a really huge game, perception-wise. Number two, the penalties were just atrocious. I mean, it shows a total lack of discipline in the program. Number 5, Christian Young, when he struck that pose and it cost us getting off the field, he walked right past Kevin Sumlin when he was trying to address him. Can you imagine a player walking past a coach like Rich Rodriguez or Dick Tomey their scholarship would be done and they'd be on a bus going home today. Can you address a little bit about what you see and know about the internal workings of the discipline of this program? Thanks.
So I'll start with the first question, and I think it's a huge game. I agree. I think this is maybe outside of the first ASU game last year, which again didn't go well, and Arizona fans remember that and understand what that meant, losing that game to ASU in his first year. That just sets you up for negativity moving forward, and there's still a lot of fans who are angry about that. But I think this is probably right underneath that in terms of importance to him and his future and the perception of what people have of him. It's going to be important this week. I mentioned this is the crucial game, I think, on the schedule, and could send Arizona in a positive direction, or could send them in a very negative direction. Right now, to put it simply, I don't think Arizona's ready to see a Power 5 program. I think we've seen that. Hawaii beats them. NAU gives them a bigger challenge than what was anticipated, and it just doesn't feel like a team that's ready to face another Power 5 school right now, and that's not good. I mean, Arizona is about to get into the Pac-12 schedule next week, or in a couple weeks, when they play UCLA after the bye week, and you just don't want to be in that position. So I think it is an important game. I think Arizona, the one thing they can't do, you can lose this game, but you can't be embarrassed, and with what we've seen from the defense and what we've seen from Texas Tech so far, there is the potential for that. This could be one of those games where Arizona does get embarrassed if they're not on top of their game, and that's scary. I mean, you don't want to have that as hanging over your head if you're Arizona. It does feel like the type of game that's going to be more of a shootout, which Arizona has a chance to be in, and obviously you have an offense that's capable of scoring points, as we saw last week. But that's not the type of game you want to be in. You want to be in a game where your defense is actually playing pretty well and can hold the team down and make it easier on the offense to do its job, and not have to score every drive. And there is that potential this week, and it's interesting to see how it's all going to come together, to see how the team feels, to see what the mood is. But we'll know about this team Saturday night. By the end of the game Saturday night, we're going to know what this Arizona team is, I think, a lot more. We're going to understand what they're about and where the season is headed. And I think it's one of those games, if Arizona comes out and plays well. On the flip side, we've been talking about a lot of negative things so far, since Saturday night and today on this podcast. But on the positive side, if Arizona is able to win and can show that it is ready to play a Power 5 team, I think it does set them up for some success. Obviously, we mentioned UCLA already and not having a good season, and a lot of disappointment there with what Chip Kelly's doing so far. If Arizona can go into the Pac-12 season with a win over UCLA, and then you get Colorado, obviously they beat Nebraska, looking a little bit tougher under their new coaching staff there. But I think it's fair to call it one of the most important games for Kevin Sumlin in his short Arizona tenure. It's just a crucial game. There's no way around it. Arizona needs to show up and needs the defense to play well, needs the offense to play well, and needs to limit those mistakes, because Arizona needs this win. As much as you can have a must-win game in the third game of the season, Arizona, this is a must-win for the Wildcats this week, and it's the turning point of the season, in my opinion. To your second point, this is one of the things that I mentioned, and I think it's obviously it's been a knock on Kevin Sumlin over the course of his career, is he's a player's coach, and there's positives and there's negatives to that, much like there's positives and negatives to the type of coach that Rich Rodriguez was. The positives to someone like Kevin Sumlin being the head coach is, as we mentioned before, he's a little more hands off with the assistant coaching staff. They respect that. They like having the freedom to make decisions and coach their groups. Players generally like not being yelled at. It's rare when we've been able to see, at least when the media has their access to practice, it's rare to see Kevin Sumlin raise his voice or go after a player. It's happened from time to time, but it's very rare, and I think making things comfortable for players, I think, can bring some good results and make them enjoy coming to practice and make them excited about the team. But it can also have negative negative effects as well. I think you're starting to see some of those, and that's the concern, and that's been kind of one of the knocks before on Kevin Sumlin, is that this idea of being a player's coach, of being a little bit more making things a little more comfortable for players, is it has a chance to turn and the players start to, maybe have less respect for the authority of the team and the head coach. And I don't know that Arizona's there yet, but you get a glimpse of that when something like what you mentioned with Christian Young happens, and he's walking right by the coach when the coach is trying to talk to him. It's little things like that can become big things, and I think that's one of the aspects that you run a risk of when you have that type of style to you. Like I said, there are positives to it, and there could be good things that come out of Kevin Sumlin having the demeanor he has, having the approach he has. It could make it a fun environment to be around and make people want to work and want to play hard for you. But there are the negatives to that, and that is one of them. So it'll be interesting to see if he can deliver on what he said and what he was talking about Saturday night when he said there are going to be players that just don't get on the field because when they do things like Christian Young did, Arizona's not necessarily in the position to be benching players that are starters, but maybe that's the way to get it done, and we'll see if he can deliver on that and if that is what ends up happening or how he goes about the discipline. But that is one of the concerns, and I think it's a valid concern to have about a coach who's been more of a player's coach. You don't want the players kind of dictating where things go, and that's the risk you run when you have a situation like Arizona has, and it can turn into that. But we'll see, and this is the moment in time where Kevin Sumlin needs to step up and show that he's the leader and show that it's his program, and he's not going to tolerate a lot of what took place Saturday night, and we'll see if that happens. But I think we'll know Saturday night kind of what it looks like and who's out there, but that's definitely a concern, and I think a valid one for Arizona fans. So now we have a question from the message boards. AZCats, like the name, ask, what does the defense have to do the rest of the season to save defensive coordinator Marcel Yates' job? If Arizona wins 8 or 9 games, but they give up 40 points a game, does he still coach the defense next season? It's a good question. Right now, I think the way things are going, it's going to be tough for Arizona to make a case for extending Marcel Yates. It's the final year of his contract. Coordinators usually sign shorter contracts. He signed a 2-year deal the last time, when Kevin Sumlin was hired, and so he's in the second year of that deal now. As of this point, I think it's going to be difficult to make the case for Arizona fans and to Arizona fans that he's the right guy for the job. I mean, based on what we've seen through 2 games. He's now in his 4th season with the team. The players that are part of the defense are people he recruited. There's really no excuses for why Arizona should be playing the way it has on defense. And if that continues, and I don't think, if Arizona continues to give 40 points and has to play in a shootout, wins help a lot, but wins can't mask that. And I think it's going to be important for Arizona to start to get that down. That number has to go down. They can't live like that. They might have to, and they might have to try. I don't know that I have the confidence that they are going to get that number down, but the offense isn't as potent as it could be, and we've seen when it goes through kind of these weird stretches where it just can't get the ball in the end zone. And if Arizona itself was putting up 50 points a game, it wouldn't be a concern. You could live with that, I think, but we just don't know what we're going to get from the Arizona offense either from game to game. So I just don't think Arizona could live like that. I think if they are giving up 40 points a game, they aren't going to win 8 or 9 games. So that is kind of a moot point right now, because I don't think that would happen. But I think that number has to go down, and I think for Marcel Yates right now, it's still too early. I think we'll know more Saturday. If Saturday's a disaster, then I think the talk about what happens at the defensive coordinator position becomes a lot more real. And maybe there's a decision made sooner rather than later on that. But I don't know exactly what Arizona would have to do. I think if you win 8 or 9 games this season, I don't think they would be giving up 40 points a game, in which case maybe you do have to re-up him and keep him on board. Because I think that would be the key. I think if Arizona's going to win 8 or 9 games, other than Khalil Tate turning into October 2017 Khalil Tate, it's going to have to come from the defense, and I think that's where it'll have to start. So if they win 8 or 9 games, naturally they won't be giving up 40 points, in my opinion. So, and then maybe that's what happens and that's what saves. But I think that could be the only thing right now, is them continuing to win games and to win meaningful games. And the schedule doesn't set up well, especially on the back end. And And now Colorado, as I mentioned, kind of looks like a tougher out than maybe anticipated. So we'll have to see, but it's not good right now. And like I said before, I think we'll know more Saturday night and understand more about what this team is and who it is by the end of this Texas Tech game. The second part of AZ Cat's question is, how involved is Kevin Sumlin on the defensive side of the ball? And this is something I've addressed before. I think I talked about it last week on the podcast. I think it feels like it's changing a little bit. I think he's had more input, especially in the offseason, in deciding kind of what the defense looks like. As I mentioned earlier in this podcast and others before this, he is a little bit more hands-off with his coaching staff. He lets them do what they do, and coaches like that. I think this year's been a little bit different. I think he's been a little bit more involved in making some of the decisions. Game day, it's going to be up to those coaches and up to the coordinators to make the play calls and to decide what they want to do. But I think in terms of the game plan and especially the overall look of the defense, I think he's had a little bit bigger hand in what's going on. But at the end of the day, it's not going to be on him what happens with the defense. It's going to be on the coordinators because they're the ones making the decisions. And yes, he kind of oversees everything, but at least on the defensive side of the ball, it's going to be a lot on Marcel Yates, and maybe we'll see that change. Maybe if it gets bad and it continues to go the way it's going right now with Arizona giving up as many yards and as many points as it is, maybe he starts to step in a little bit more. It would be a little bit out of character, I think, for him, based on what we know of him so far and what coaches have talked about with him. But right now, it's going to be on Marcel Yates to get this group going, and we'll see what happens. But the defense just has to be better. There's no way around it. It hasn't looked good, and it's going to be key to them turning the season around and having the type of year that they want. Well, that's going to do it for this podcast, everybody. It's a little bit shorter one. We didn't want to get into every single negative. I think there's been a lot of discussion already about what's been going on with this team, especially in that game Saturday night. But we'll have more. I think now we'll kind of turn the page and start looking at the transition to Texas Tech week. Press conference on Monday with Kevin Sumlin. Players will get their opportunity to talk Tuesday afternoon. So continue to look out for our coverage of that. We'll have some more answers about where everyone's head is, what the mood is coming off that Saturday win against NAU, and figure out kind of where things go from here. I think there's going to be some excitement within the team for this game against Texas Tech. It's the first quote-unquote real opponent that they're going to be playing. Obviously the first Power 5 school on the schedule, and a formidable opponent. So we'll see what happens. But thank you everybody for listening, and make sure to stay tuned for the coverage of Kevin Sumlin's press conference on Monday, the players on Tuesday, and the rest of our coverage this week leading into Texas Tech on Saturday night.
Thank you for listening to this episode of GoAZCats.com today. GoAZCats.com is the totally unofficial U of A fan site and your source for University of Arizona team coverage and recruiting news.